ESG stands for Environmental Social Governance, and it has to do with sustainability. It's a measuring system that corporations use to decide whether or not they're meeting those standards. The reason I bring it up is because I want to point out that social is part of that. We're not just talking about saving plants and animals when we talk about sustainability, we're talking about people. And the Bible actually has a social security program, a social safety net for the poor, and especially for poor immigrants. And that's what we're talking about this week on the live show.
Kindred UMC live show features adults discussing adult topics, occasionally with adult language. It may not be suitable for young viewers. Please use discretion before watching.
Hello all, welcome once again to the Kindred UMC pre-recorded live show, coming to you not live but pre-recorded from my front room, aka Kindred Studio A. My name is Chris Hayden and I'm the pastor of Kindred UMC.
I'm Ann and I'm the treasurer for Kindred UMC.
I'm Preston and I hope you have a nice hat.
A nice hat makes a difference.
It really does.
And it's a weird thing. At some day when you don't wear hats, you have to make a decision.
Yeah.
Like, I think today's the day I'm gonna wear a hat. And I've recently made that transition, and I should be celebrated for it. Welcome to you all. I've decided not to clean up the space. Somebody in a very powerful position told me to clean up the space, and I'm not doing it.
I don't know what that means.
Yeah, me. Well,
Less people? We shouldn't be here?
Yeah. Well, like the umbrella and my fanny pack, and it's like, this is my front room.
Oh.
This is my front room. So this is the way it looks. I live here. That's that. Didn't mean to make it super weird right off the bat.
Thank you for that.
Here we are.
I mean, now we know what we're in for
I
today.
feel welcome.
Yeah.
I feel very welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your fanny pack can be over
Do
there.
you feel welcome?
Why is the door locked?
There's no
You're not going anywhere.
So we're going to continue talking about sustainability as an idea and like the Christian response to not only environmentalism, but we're going to talk about the social aspects today of sustainability. And I'm going to just pull from the OT, just straight up Leviticus, the book of the laws, Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 and 10. So Leviticus, it is the setting of Leviticus is back in like Moses leading the Israelites out of the Egyptian slavery setting into the wilderness and then ultimately into the promised land. And the book of Leviticus is like, okay, how does a new nation, how does this new group of people actually relate to each other? What are the laws? What are our social agreements? How do we punish people who kind of deviate from that? That's what Leviticus really is. It actually was written much, much later than that. So even though the book is set in that time period, it was written during the Babylonian exile. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, but look, here's the text. Leviticus 19, 9 through 10. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edge of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. We'll talk about that word. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. So we've got a couple of different words in English, reaping and gleaning. So reaping is you grow the crops. This is an agriculture society, agrarian, and you grow your crops. When they become ripe and ready to harvest, you reap them. And that's the harvest. It's what we would typically understand as the harvest. When you're doing that, during that process of it becoming ripe, some things over-ripen and they fall. And then even in just the process of like harvesting, you leave behind some stuff. The law in Israel is that you do not pick those up. If they fall, if you miss them, they fall to the ground and they live there now. Same thing with vineyards. Grapes, as they ripen, some certain grapes are going to ripen a little faster than the other ones, and you're really waiting for like the best time and the best weather and all that stuff. But in the meantime, some grapes are going to ripen and they're going to naturally fall to the ground. You're not allowed to harvest those in Israel like in ancient Israel. The reason for that is the word gleaning. So these are called gleanings. They're the things that fall to the ground naturally, and that is their social security, like safety net.
Okay.
So if you are an alien in Israel, if you are impoverished, say a widow or an orphan, the way that you survive is that you reap the gleanings. So you go to the fields, and even if you can't quite get a job working the fields, you can at least pick up the stuff that's left behind, and you can get enough wheat or enough barley, which is a story we're going to talk about, the book of Ruth. You can get enough barley to like make bread for the day, just based off of what's left on the ground. So it's kind of like a social security thing for the poor. This particularly comes into effect in one of the books of the Bible called Ruth. The story of Ruth, chapter 2 in particular, has a very critical component. Ruth is not an Israelite. She's a Moabite. And she's an alien in the land, and she's like a hero in the Bible. She's like one of the major heroes in the Bible. And when we first kind of get to know her, she is literally reaping the gleanings of the fields in Israel. She's come from out of the country into a foreign land, and the way that she survives is by living off of the leftovers that the Israelites are not allowed to fully harvest, So I'm setting up a paradigm for us to talk about the Christian responsibility, not just individually, but systemically, towards people who are in poverty, people who genuinely lack the ability to compete in a capitalist market, because that's where we live. We live in a capitalist market. You have to be able to hold down a job to earn income to feed yourself and your loved ones. That's the thing. But also we have some social systems. We have some safety nets and some networks and stuff. So first of all, before we get into any of that, just what has been your experience growing up in the church? What has been your experience with Christianity and poverty, specifically in our kind of American Western environment, in our setting, in our context?
I remember being a kid and, the youth, every year we would do the 30-hour famine.
Dude, 30-hour famine!
It was the best,
Yeah.
right? It was fun. I don't think I ever made it the 30 hours. I weighed like 100 pounds and was 11 years old, and I was like, you guys, I'm going to die. Like, this is
all right,
not
so
okay.
can
You guys did that for fun?
Can you explain the logistics of 30-hour famine?
Okay, so 30-hour famine, I don't remember all the things because this is going back
I'll
a very
correct you
long
because
time.
I was a youth director when we did it.
Oh,
so I
good.
had
So
to
you know
enforce
the
the
actual
rules.
things?
Yeah.
So 30-hour famine, you would
Also,
not...
I love correcting. Sorry, go ahead.
You would go to the church. You went to school all day, and that was part of your 30 hours. And then we would start...
You skip lunch.
You skip lunch.
Yeah.
Yep, it started at like noon, I think.
Yeah.
And then you would go to the church, and you could have drinks, is what we were allowed. I don't know what the real rules are, but we were allowed to have drinks, but no solid food for 30 hours was the goal. So
Yeah.
you went, and then you also had to do chores. Like they had these little,
Yeah.
like things that you would do to kind of mimic, because I think it was for Africa somewhere.
I don't know what exactly. I can't remember all the specific details.
Yeah.
I should have asked you because I could have looked it up. This is such an easy Google. Just Google it. 30-hour famine.
30-hour famine. It's still there.
But I think it's. I have it in my head that it's partnership with Compassion International.
It's with somebody.
But I don't remember exactly. But Compassion is the organization that I still give to this day. So I can't remember if it's exactly, but that doesn't feel right to me. Anyway, Google it. You can find out the details.
You had to do chores that were supposed to mimic like these kids in poverty in these other
Yes.
countries that you were raising the money for. Because that was the other bit, is you would go and ask people to donate money
would, like,
to you
sponsor
to
you.
starve.
Yeah, they would sponsor you. And it's like it's kind of like a walkathon.
Yes.
Like every hour I make it, will you give me $10? You know?
And see, we just got flat rates because people...
Oh, well, yeah, that's a way
We
to do
cheated.
it too.
Yeah.
Well,
But-
we cheated too. So what we did was, And this was a brilliant idea, and shout out to Jad Denmark, who was the youth director that I was working with at the time. I was the associate youth director, and he was the senior director. And I think he stole the idea from someone else too. So, screw you, Jad. No, that's what we do. We steal from the best. That's what we do.
That's right.
But the idea that we did was, so you eat breakfast on Friday at school, you skip lunch, and then you come to the lock-in where you're going to spend the night at the church. And the first night for dinner, what we had was a third world meal, which is basically just rice and water. And that's what it was. You ate rice and water. It's really hard to describe how disgusting it is, even though you're starved. You're really hungry. But when you get that bowl of rice and water, you're like, oh, this sucks. And it really starts to take an emotional toll. And then Saturday for breakfast, what we had was a second world meal, which is rice again, and an egg and milk, like a glass of milk. And you have it, and now part of this is, I think, because our folks couldn't cook, because I think I could make that. I could make that meal work really well, actually. But when you eat it, you're like, oh, I'm starving, and this still isn't great. It's milk and an egg and rice, and you're eating it, and you're like, oh man. And then by the time we get to, it's Saturday afternoon, we do lunch. It's our final meal, and we have from a first world country, which is America, which is like abundance. And his version of that was to basically buy a bunch of McDonald's.
Yeah.
Yep.
An abundance of McDonald's. And we put it on the altar. And it was and it was kind of like communion. We didn't do communion because we didn't have a pastor there, and there's rules about that. But it was basically, it felt like communion. And I'm telling you, and it was covered and not visible, and it was the final kind of worship service, the conclusion for the whole thing. And when we pull the drape off of the altar and it's filled with cheeseburgers and chicken nuggets and french fries and stuff, everyone cries.
Yeah.
It is a severely emotional it is a real thing when you really start to just, even for a second, consider empathetically the plight of people who are really impoverished. It was a really powerful experience for me.
It was, but as a kid, I didn't respect it as much. As I'm older and I look back at it, I'm like, no, that was actually very, I learned a lot from that.
We also set up tents. We had a giant fellowship hall. We set up tents and kind of lived in a tent city for the night, And we had, there was all kinds of stuff that was just very eye-opening. And I was a youth director. I wasn't even a student. And I was like, oh my God. I had no idea some of this stuff was going on, So, and then that honestly, that's before we even got into the other global geopolitical stuff of sex trafficking and effective slavery and, and slave labor in China. And there's all these other things that are just oh my gosh, it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about the overwhelming thing, because I think the feeling of overwhelming is the enemy of doing good where we can.
Or discussion, even that.
Yeah. Well,
people don't want to discuss it because I can't deal with that right now, or everything that I'm thinking about is going to leave because it's not as important. And now I feel...
Sorry, my dog's barking. I don't know if it's coming through the audio. I just want to address it. We're just going to ignore it and be fine. Okay, so before we get into that, though, what's been your kind of experience?
Oh, I would go live with the homeless. They would just dump us out on Paramore in downtown, and no.
Oh my gosh.
My parents were really cool.
They cared about us a lot, and our safety was really
bring back new information. We would do Coalition for the Homeless, which was I think ironically off of Paramore downtown. It was by the Bob Carr Center. It's what I can remember when I was a kid.
It was all Orlando references.
In Orlando. And there were just an endless endless amount of people that were just ready to eat always. So we had like or a designated couple that was just our connect with them. Shout out to the Jose's, RIP. But it was, as a sixth grader, eye-opening because these people, more or less, your friends would call them monsters because they were scary and would talk weird and live outside for some reason, which in sixth grade you kind of wanted to as a boy anyway. So you're like, well, they're kind of cool. Yeah. And then you watch Dennis the Menace and you see that
You
that
never have to take a shower?
Yes.
That sounds awesome.
There's no rules. So yeah, shout out to Mustard Man and Mr. Pickles. They were always there on time and first in line every single time. It was just eye-opening. It was because we got to go back home. And so the whole car ride home was like, what are they going to do?
Right.
They're probably going to go in a tent or under a bridge or something.
Yeah.
And like, that's it. And there's no books. There's definitely no internet or TV. Although now I have, after working with the homeless a little bit more in my adult life, there is a surprisingly large amount of homeless people with phones, like internet access now.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of a thing. That's how important the internet has become in our society. Like, so first of all, let me shout out to the table at Goldenrod, which is the dinner church that sprung out of the same church that we sprung out of, Aloma UMC. And they're actively involved with this community, and that's been part of my education around like what it takes to be homeless. Like and I mean that in a very literal way. Because on the one hand, there's a dynamic of, there are certain people who just can't compete, and it very often, I'll say, comes down to mental illness a lot of the time. And then occasionally it also comes down to literal physical disability. And then you combine that with a lack of like a family system, lack of a support system.
Political involvement. There's a lot of that.
Drug and alcohol.
Addiction is a severe cause of that. And there's a strong correlation between people with mental illness or addiction and people who lack support, because let's face it, people with mental illness and addiction have a tendency to burn a lot of bridges, and at some point their family and their friends just start to go like, I can't, for my own sanity, I can't be involved with you anymore. And so the reason I lift this up is because none of this is a new problem.
Right.
No.
Like, this is a human thing. And even Jesus says in the Gospels, like, we will never be in I can't remember the exact, depending on the translation, but he essentially says we'll never be away from the poor. We'll always have people who are impoverished. That is, and there's something kind of, people in my experience who are trying to solve the problem and address it often, leave that baby in the bathwater that they're throwing out. They want to eradicate poverty, and it's like, hey man, that's not only is that not feasible, but that's not even a biblical model. Like, the biblical model is, we have to swallow the pill of, there are going to be people with problems that you can't solve. And then also, very important, that doesn't mean we should give up on them and not help them. And so that's kind of the dynamic I want to talk about. I don't know if you've ever been in this situation, but this happens to me a lot. Driving, somebody with a sign under an overpass, and I go back and forth in my heart about, like, what do I do here? What do I do here?
I've seen too many of them get into cars.
Yeah.
That's their
It's
job.
like, what do I do here? Like, there's something nefarious if you start to talk about poverty and impoverished people. You are necessarily going to be dealing with not everybody, but there is a
a kind of person who is slightly more sociopathic who kind of runs in those circles. And it's like, and there is this weird thing of like, so what am I doing here? How do I help? What do I do? And that's the overwhelming feeling that I feel all the time. It's like, I don't have enough in me to actually help the systemic problem here. I don't believe that I can trust this individual because I don't know who they are or what's going on. I don't realistically have the time to sit down and have an interview and a conversation and like do a background check or anything. Yeah. And so I find myself often in this place of like, oh, God, what do I do here? So before we talk about that, do you identify with that? Do you have any of those experiences? Does that come up for you?
Definitely an experience. I also have like a biblical reference and an experiential reference.
Okay.
Or like analogy, not really.
I'm very curious about both of those.
So the biblical one's the farmer sowing the seeds. So, and just to like paraphrase it so I don't say the whole thing, you're going to throw some seed and it's going to fall into concrete or rock and it's not going to grow. Some of them might, to be honest, because cactus can grow kind of anywhere. But the others that somehow find their way into good soil because in the analogy.
Sometimes the crows come.
Sometimes yeah.
Yeah.
But in the analogy, the whole point is if there's you gave the seed the push and you helped one seed. That's one seed that's growing into a plant.
God's asking you to cast seed.
Yeah.
And where it comes up into fruit isn't your responsibility.
It's not on us, but our dilemma is it feels like it's on us because they're seeing my eyeballs.
Well, it's
and
like, but I've only got so much seed.
Yeah.
So where do I throw it?
Yeah.
Like that's the other
Well,
side.
So the real world analogy is the bailing water out of the sinking ship. You're like, okay, if I had 1 million hours and the ship was going down really, really slowly, I could do this on my own. However,
let's take shifts and we'll make it home. You know.
Right.
Well, and how many of those people do you pass on your way home from work? Sometimes one, sometimes 5. And it's like, okay, if I get $5 every time I see somebody.
Major intersection to the west, I can always count on somebody being there.
Yeah.
And I don't recognize, like it's a different person.
person.
Like I don't recognize a consistently same person. And I'm like, so what do they chase each other away? What's the dynamic here? I don't really know. Yeah. And you're right. Like if I do it every time I drive by, like now all of a sudden I'm budgeting like $500.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I would rather just give to Compassion International because I believe that is going to a good place.
And they can help better than I can.
Yeah.
At least.
Somebody that I know had a relative.
And I know for sure that they are. Like I've literally looked into it.
Yeah.
You know.
Somebody I know had a relative that did have a drug problem and ended up homeless, and there was a whole sad sob story that went to that. But what her solution was, on occasion, she didn't do it all the time, but if she caught somebody at an intersection and she was about to go to McDonald's or the gas station or whatever, she'd be like, hey, I'm going over there. If you meet me over there in 5 minutes, I will buy you food.
Yeah.
And that was always her thing. So if the one guy showed up and he goes, I can really have whatever I want. She's like, yeah, man, pick whatever you want. And he goes,
McDonald's.
My buddy is down the street. Can I go get him and come back? And she was like, absolutely. I'll wait. That's fine. And like he went and got his friend and they were like, we can have food? And she was like, I was so happy to give them food. She goes, I just have a hard time giving them money because a gift card or something because I just don't know. She goes, but food.
Yeah, I learned a lot when I was, my earlier appointments was in a kind of an older downtown area, like and there was a lot of homeless people, a lot of drug users that would come seeking help, and they wanted cash, and I was like, we don't give cash. Well, write me a check, and we don't do that. Like, and some of them would get genuinely aggressive and upset with me, and like, you know, fair enough, that's fine. I mean, like, I understand.
Fueled aggression.
Yeah. I have a concealed carry permit and a pepper spray and like, you know, I'm not terribly afraid.
Wrong state. Because it's not me, it's 3 people behind me, I promise.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm not terribly, and also like I was never alone with anybody, you know, like all that stuff, like proper precautions. But all right, so here's the final kind of piece of this that I think we need to talk about. In my experience, I think a lot of people use the they're all drug addicts, they're all this or that, as an excuse to not be generous. And I don't mean generous in like, I'm not asking anybody to empty their bank accounts, but I mean in an attempt to not be human and Christian and responsive to the need that you're, like it or not, the theology that we believe in is that when somebody comes across your path and asks for help, Jesus demands that you help them.
How about if I can make you cry? If somebody's down and out,
Here we go.
come on. If they're down and out, you got to be the hand.
But, well,
Not only do you need to be, you
neighbor,
have to be.
neighbor asks for help,
Yeah.
you help. Neighbor asks for help, you help. Now, I understand that there are some caveats in the like, okay, what's the best way to help?
If he's
I
hanging
understand.
off an overpass, I don't know if I'm going to help you. But
Like, and
I can
how much do I risk? What,
Yeah.
Like, what's a responsible choice for my personal safety?
Yes.
These are all important conversations, important considerations in the whole thing. And I really want to challenge everyone who's listening. Are you using that as an excuse to not help and not get involved? And if you are, I just encourage you to take a look at that. Like, pray about it, invite a conversation with you and God about it, involve other people about it, like check in with other people. Because there are times I'm like, I don't have time, I gotta go. And then there are other times it's like, come on, man, you got time. You got time, you got money. One of the things that I talked about with one of our folks, who she doesn't like when I say this, but I think it's important to say this. We're rich. I'm rich.
In spirit.
I'm not wealthy. I'm not wealthy. You know what I mean? We still have a mortgage and we still have car loans and but we are rich. We live in a very nice house. We we drive cars that we can rely on. If we spend a day that's hot because our AC isn't running, that's like a wild exception to the rule. We're comfortable and satiated and all the time. We're rich by global standards. And when we lose sight of that, that's a problem. And I think a lot of people use they're just going to spend it on drugs. They're just going to do as an excuse to not be engaged in the issue of, hey man, we are surrounded by people who just can't genuinely compete in our economic system, and they genuinely need help. And more often than not, and I've had bad experiences where I offer food or a bus pass, or hey man, I know Hope Community Center in Kissimmee. I know the director. I can text her right now and probably get a response before the end of the day. I'll send you there. And they're like, nah, I'd really just like the cash. I'm like, get out of here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's something about, but bothering to have the conversation and bothering to engage the actual issue. I think a lot of times we use the broad, generalization of an entire population as an excuse to not be engaged in what we are clearly called as Christians to be engaged in, which is to address the social injustice, the social disbalance of economic, people who can't feed. I'm not even talking about the wealthy. Hey man, if you worked hard, if you invented microchips, fair play to you. Good invention. We need it, I'm talking about the difference between I don't have to worry about food in my refrigerator and somebody who may be sleeping without a tent tonight. Though that's a difference that we can actually be involved in. And I encourage everyone to actually do a little soul searching, say some prayers, listen to what God is calling you to do. And maybe we don't have to glean 100% of our harvest. Maybe we can give some of what we earn to the people who can't compete and the people who really need help. So, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.
What's our sustainability challenge?
Oh, I'm gonna have to do that on social media.